all of the students that we have touched, reached. This is like, I mean, it's probably 50 students. Yeah, at least. And we've had, and so, you know what, give these guys a round of applause. They're the ones who are doing all the data work. My face is in the paper, but they do all the work. So I want to say that, like, again, to reiterate, the reason why we've been able to do what we've done is by utilizing youth. And youth come with fresh ideas, and they come and they're willing to take on the challenges that sometimes adults who are jaded are like, I'm not touching that. So I just want to say, again, shout out to youth. I'm really excited about this next panel. We're going to be, I know Mike is like, I'm not young. I'm not youth. We're like, well, but you know, he's young enough, right? Yeah, so once you have a kid, it feels like maybe I'm not youth anymore. But I'm really excited about this panel. We've got a couple of SSDP members on the panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Roman Rivera. I think he can introduce everyone just by. He's from U of C, and let it go. All right.
Hello? Oh, good. All right. So my name is Roman Rivera. I'm a third-year student at the University of Chicago, and I'm the vice president of the SSDP chapter there. And to my left is Danny, and she is a journalist and graduate student at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. And further on is Mike, and he is currently the executive director of Enlaces Chicago, okay? And he's been so since 2010. And then Bill Marie Narlock is a board member of SSDP and has worked for the ICDP for how many years? A long time. Yeah, and so now I'd like to start with our first question. What are the drug policy issues that have the greatest impact on Latino youth, and specifically those in Chicago? Let's start with you, Danny.
Sure. Well, I am not originally from Chicago. I'm originally from California, and I've lived here for about 6 months, so it'd probably be a little easier for me to speak to it from my perspective. But I think one of the larger issues, at least that I've seen firsthand, is sort of the really high rates of incarceration for low-level drug offenses. We introduce people to the system who don't really belong in the system because of our skewed drug policy. So I think that's one of the largest issues, and one thing that I've seen multiple times firsthand. And to speak to my own experience, both my parents have been in jail on drug offenses, primarily low-level drug offenses, and so it's a destructive drug policy, and that's just one of, I think, many issues.
Mike?
So first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on a beautiful Friday evening, afternoon I should say. Really looking forward to hanging out with my daughter and playing later tonight. As Katie said, I am a jaded adult, excited to be one, but I think I've been jaded back and forth, so hopefully I'm on the good side of jade right now. I am the executive director of Enlace. Our mission is to improve the quality of life of Little Village residents, and Little Village is the largest concentration of Latinos in the Midwest. You might know us as 26th Street, the second Magnificent Mile. You might also know Little Village by 26th and Cal. Do you know what's on 26th and Cal?
The largest mental health facility in the United States.
No, there's a Popeyes on the corner. That's yeah, the county jail. That's the eastern port of entry to the neighborhood. I thought, you know, in reading this question, I thought what I'd prefer to do is give a little bit of broader kind of background on the situation of Latino youth, particularly as it relates to the Cook County JTDC and then nationally as well. And I promise to do that in 30 seconds. Okay, I'm lying about 30 seconds.
So JT, say what?
The Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, and just incarceration in general. So Latinos make up about 26% of the city of Chicago's population, and a smaller percentage of the state of Illinois' population than that, but we're the fastest growing group in the state of Illinois, and the largest minority in the state. However, in the state of Illinois and in Cook County, we're actually underrepresented in the juvenile justice system. But nationally, we are certainly overrepresented, right? And the distinction between our underrepresentation here in the state is that we have a large African American population, and the African American population tends to be extremely overrepresented, right? So if it wasn't for the overrepresentations of African Americans in the systems, Latinos would be overrepresented in the system. But as a matter of fact, the way we track Latinos in our criminal justice system actually does not paint a full picture of the disproportionality between blacks and whites in the system. Because many times, Latinos are coded as whites in the system. As a matter of fact, in the town of Cicero, which is 85% Hispanic, Mexican American mostly, 85% of those arrested were white over the last decade. But their last names were Rodriguez, Sanchez, and Salazar. Sounds like a law firm, right? So our organization, in partnership with the National Council La Raza and Models for Change and friends here, have worked on really looking at how coding happens in the state of Illinois. So when I think about what's the greatest impact on youth in general, I think the misclassification of Latinos in our system, it leads to some major issues in the way we look at data, the way we interpret data, right? And as well, Latinos are largely undercounted in the system. We did a study of the 7 points of the juvenile justice system in the state of Illinois, 9 points, forgive me, and only 2 of those points actually coded for Latinos. So just recently we got some legislation passed that codes for Latinos at the arrest point throughout the state, and we're looking to expand that moving forward. I would be remiss not to talk about drug laws, and particularly marijuana laws, and how that impacts Latino youth, and it already impacts Latino youth throughout the country. But I'll leave that to my fellow panelists to go deeper in. So, sorry, that 30 seconds turned into 2 minutes. Forgive me.
Villemarie?
Yes, hi. So that's a very good point, Mike. What drug policy issues have the greatest impact on Latino youth here? We don't really know. The data is not clear because of what you mentioned. I will definitely piggyback on the fact that the marijuana policies here, just like we discussed in our last panel, there's definitely a bit of a patchwork of policies that kind of tend to impact certain parts of our city where we have predominantly Latinos living. One thing that I did want to sort of touch on that none of our questions really get to, but it's something that kind of came up this week that impacts me greatly, or I guess my people greatly, being Puerto Rican, is, I don't know if you guys saw the story that was around about Puerto Rico shipping their heroin addicts to Chicago. So as a Puerto Rican living in Chicago, I'm still sort of like stewing on this sort of story and like not really knowing how to react. So I'm pretty emotional about it actually, angry about it obviously. So yeah, that's kind of an issue that I think is something that we could definitely be addressing also.
We're definitely going to talk about that article a little bit later on.
Awesome.
The second question I have is, we all know that U.S. drug policies heavily impact the states around us, specifically in Latin America and in Mexico, especially. And so what do you think that the impact of drug policies are on the undocumented youth and adults that enter these countries, or this country? Amy?
Sure. I think from what I've seen, just on a person-to-person level, is it causes people who already live in fear to live in greater fear. And I think just a quick note throughout this panel, you're probably going to see me speak to more personal things rather than like policy things, because that's sort of where my knowledge is. And yeah, so it takes a group of people who are already sort of, I think, shunned and ostracized by American society, causes them to live in fear, even more so.
Michael?
So I think this is a bit of a complicated question, because the thing that I want to talk about is not undocumented youth when I talk about U.S. drug policies. I want to talk about the fact that our drug policies essentially end up moving tons of drugs from Latin America to this country, but then also moves a bunch of guns the other way,
Yes.
right? When you think about cartels, when you think about the gangs have really been transported from the States and have moved to Latin America and caused mayhem there. And has really reinforced the fact that a lot of low-wage, lower educated individuals in Latin America really don't have a place there. So they really try to find their place here in the country. The one thing I will talk about as far as undocumented youth is the fact is that they are largely much more, they are less likely to be involved in an arrest or in a crime or report a crime. They're just kind of off the map. The fact is when we think about young people who are involved in negative lifestyles in our community, and by the way, Little Village was just number 30 community area on your map there. It's called South Lawndale, but Little Village. We have the largest raw number, and percentage of the undocumented in the state of Illinois. Of our 80,000 residents, 20,000 are undocumented, and about half of our population is under the age of 25. Wow. So undocumented youth is a major group in our community, and a group that really is actually very aspiring, very much not on the wrong side of the law outside of their status, right? And I would even argue that that shouldn't even be on the wrong side of the law, but that's another topic, I think. So I just want to make sure that folks do know that undocumented youth are much less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system generally.
Sure. So I think one of the things that I see in my day job, I'm a therapist out in Joliet, and I work with a lot of folks, Latinos, both documented and undocumented, and one of the things that I see that's a big stressor for them is their families sort of back in their home countries, and the concern that they have for them living in these areas where there is a lot of drug cartel activity and violence happening, and sort of how that impacts their daily life with having very little communication with them, and yet still trying to sort of get by day to day and make a life for themselves and their families here.
So, according to recent research, Latinos have shown to be more progressive on drug policy reform issues than African Americans. And, why do you think that might be? Bill Marie?
I thought about this question a little bit. I wasn't totally sure. I think one of the things that could potentially be involved in this is, immigration issues, and if someone has a drug crime on their record, the likelihood of being deported, could be possibly pretty high. So that's one thing that I think people think about a little bit when they're thinking about their beliefs about drug policy and drug policy reform.
Michael? Because they're listening to me. No, I mean, I think I really like the fact that you were going to go anecdotal in your own story, and I like to talk about my own story. The fact is that when I was a young person, the first time I knew that I was no longer a child was when I was 13. My uncle was high, and he was going after this other guy in the neighborhood who he thought had murdered my other uncle a month beforehand. And instead of sending me inside, they said, no, help us hold him back. Right? That was the time that I knew I was kind of like no longer a child, right? But that interaction with the criminal justice system at that point, because the cops came and then beat the daylights out of my uncle, right? I think leads to families like mine to really question our justice system, right? Yeah. And thank God that I was able to be able to get a formal education and become involved with people like my friend here, Katie, and I saw Esther earlier, and Stephanie, people who have really influenced me in my thinking and what I should be reading and who I should be listening to. But I think that that's a similar situation in the African American community as well. But I think that both communities, if you ask them, do you want more police in your neighborhood, it would be a really mixed bag, yeah. Right? It would, yeah. There'd be some people who are like, heck yeah, we want more police on our streets, and then you have other folks who'd say, that's not the answer, right? Yeah. So it's I don't know if I have a good answer to your question. I thought your answer was really insightful, right? I didn't even think about that, about immigration status. I think that makes a lot of sense, but, I think that there's no clear answer to this, to be quite honest with you. I'd look to you guys to inform me. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, that's a pretty hard question, I think, and again, I really liked your answer. I think that made me think about it a little bit differently. In my own experience, and I would say that this is true for African Americans as well, but in my own experience, I think growing up with the sort of rhetoric regarding the war on drugs and that drugs are bad, and then watching my parents be arrested for drug use, it's something that's really hard to reconcile, and as I sort of grew older into adulthood, I think it allowed me to think about it a little more critically to what that does and what it does to families. But again, I think that's something that's true for African Americans as well, not just Latinos.
Speaking of families, are there unique consequences to U.S. drug policy that impact Latino families and transnational family relationships? Dan.
Sure. This is a really interesting one for me because of my family history and looking at how U.S. drug policy shapes Mexican politics, essentially, and how U.S. drug policy is basically allowed a criminal enterprise to form that's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people. And so for me, I think the way I've sort of seen that consequence come to light is my own family in Mexico and how the drug war has changed their life, the drugs that are being shipped to the United States. And then a lot of my family, they can't go back to their hometown in Mexico and visit because drug violence has become so common that it's very dangerous. So yeah, I think that sort of relationship between my family in California and my family in Mexico, that's where I've really seen it.
Michael?
Yeah, to keep on theme with the anecdotal, I haven't been back to Monterrey, Mexico in 10 years, and I was there previous to that every year, right? Visiting my family, my aunts and uncles who are still there, my distant family who are there, cousins who have gotten married there, had their quinceañeras or sweet 16. One of my family members passed away, and we just, chose not to go because our family said, hey, listen, foreigners coming into the country right now, particularly to Monterrey, which is the northern big city in the way that Chicago is the third largest city. Monterrey is very similar in that way in Mexico. And, my family's like, no, you guys should not come, right? The cartels here, it's crazy what's going on in the country. And I think things are changing a bit, and I'm hopeful, but that's an everyday reality for myself, a college-educated individual who has a graduate degree from the University of Chicago, right? Think about folks who don't have the social capital that even I do, right? In that respect, and their ability to be able to go back and forth because of this mayhem. The other obvious consequence of U.S. drug policy, particularly how it pertains to immigration status, if you get caught with any kind of, low-level or mid-level kind of drug offense, and you're undocumented, you got a one-way ticket. And coming back probably is not an option. So it's a difficult situation for our community to be in. And again, a lot of the reason that people stay underneath, kind of like the radar, that are undocumented is precisely because of these issues. And that has ramifications, right? People undocumented are less likely to call the police or report wage theft or things of that nature, right? They're just trying to stay under the radar, and that creates a third class in our society that's really, really depresses the quality of life for all Chicagoans, I would argue, or all folks in our country.
Yeah, I think that's, what you guys have sort of touched on with your own family experiences is a lot of what I see with the clients that I've worked with as well. Struggling to even be able to talk about their families because they're afraid to say something that might, get someone deported, even though, that's kind of not what I do. But, that's definitely a huge issue that I see in the work that I do. As far as my own experiences, my own family, Puerto Rico sort of has also become a bit of a hub for drug trafficking into the U.S., and so there's a lot of violence there as well. And so I've had family members that have been, victims of pretty serious crimes as a result of people doing their drug business through Puerto Rico, and it's pretty scary.
Starting with Mike, could you describe a little bit more about the situation in Mexico, specifically in relation to the U.S. drug policy themselves and how they've shaped the political climate in Mexico today?
you know, I'm not an expert whatsoever in what's going on in Mexico. I just, you know, I was born here in this country. I've lived all my life pretty much in the village. So my experience really is here in this country. What I do know anecdotally, as I stated before, is, you know, my family in Mexico is, you know, they tell us not to come, right? And we've had family members, distant family members, who were taken by the cartels and taken for ransom, right? And I can't help but think that our drug policies in this country are the reasons for that, that lack of quality of life in Mexico, right? And, you know, forgive me for just talking about Mexico. That's where, you know, half of my family's from. The other half's Puerto Rico, but, you know, we kind of lost contact with that part. But we're not even talking about Colombians and Central Americans and Venezuelans and the impact on the quality of life in those countries as well because of our drug policies. I was just talking to someone who just hired onto staff who's from Colombia, and she was talking about, you know, how their country was ravaged in the 80s and 90s because of drug policies here. And this war on drugs really became a war on inner city communities here in the cities, in our cities and urban centers here in the country, but it really became a war in Latin America, all over Latin America, particularly in Colombia now. That has shifted to Mexico, right? That drug trafficking and that origination of drugs has shifted to Mexico. They've kind of cut out the middleman, if you will, the cartels in Mexico have. So Colombia's become a bit more peaceful in that respect. But yeah, I wouldn't venture to be to talk from a perspective of an expert on how it is to live in Latin America.
Study area of yours?
A little bit, yeah.
So perhaps you can answer your own question.
It comes down to like an economic issue of high demand in the United States, and well, while we can properly enforce, and well, to some extent, properly enforce laws concerning production of drugs, in other countries where our foreign policy and our own political climate have kind of messed things up a little bit, they can't as easily, and therefore gangs and drug traffickers can better take over. In El Salvador, I believe, for instance, there were a lot of people in the United States who were illegal immigrants from there in about the 80s and 90s. And when we couldn't figure out how to get them in jail and keep them in jail, we ended up deporting them. And what do gang members that go back to a less stable country do when they're in that less stable country? Well, they make really powerful gangs that terrify people and cause them to immigrate to the United States by large numbers. And that's also seen in Mexico very obviously today. Yes?
Are some South American countries making their own path when it comes to drug laws and not kowtowing to the American way? I thought that some South American countries maybe changed some of their own policies without listening to the Americans who say you can't do it.
Most definitely. I think it's either Paraguay or Uruguay. Uruguay is just legalized marijuana.
Yes.
And like,
Uruguay has
yeah.
legalized, and they have a very different system than,
Yes,
say, Colorado.
The U.S. influence has been a little bit selective. We really love messing with Mexico, which you can tell, and Colombia, and a few other places. But definitely it's possible for countries. What?
I mean, that's
Oh,
a while
Nicaragua.
ago, but you know, still.
Oh no, it's still definitely effective today. But yeah, it's definitely other countries can forge their own path, and the countries that do are in better positions than what other countries have today. Most definitely, yeah. So could we open it up to audience questions, if there are any?
Sure.
To what extent does fear of the cartels permeate Hispanic culture in America? And is the only solution, the only one that I can think of, is total decriminalization to take the money out of the cartels? I mean, are there alternatives? Because it seems to me that it's more likely that paranoia in the Hispanic community here would grow as a result of the cartels.
Mike, would you like to take this?
so, you know, it's interesting because that very topic has been a hot topic in the past 2 years, particularly with the change in regimes in Mexico. The previous several regimes in Mexico were kind of hands-off with the drug cartels in that, you know, there was an under-the-table deal, if you will, that they can operate if they don't terrorize the people. And, you know, once the conservatives won in Mexico, they started terrorizing the cartels, which, you know, shoot, you know, part of me doesn't have a problem with that, but what ended up happening is the cartels started terrorizing the people, right? It's a really interesting thing. So now that control has gone away from the conservatives in Mexico and back to the middle party, the PRI, you know, you guys have heard of Chuy Garcia, right? Our founding executive director.
No, no
Yeah.
one in Chicago has heard of
Yeah.
Garcia.
He was the first person to bring it up to me about 2 years ago. He's like, Mike, now that there's a change in the regime, what do you think about the fact that cartels will potentially set up shop here in the States, right? And I think that largely has not happened. You know, here in the States, it seems to me like the connections from the cartels abroad here, the connections here are more likely to stay underneath the radar again. They're more likely not to want to involve the police and be a part of killings and murders and things of that nature here, because they don't want to mess up their supply channels or their demand channels, if you will. But we have had those tied with cartels arrested here in the city of Chicago. Most recently, the Loera or Luisa, I forget their names, in Little Village were arrested and sentenced to jail, but they actually worked with the FBI in bringing down several Mexican cartels in Mexico. So, I mean, there's certainly connections here in the States, but those connections haven't, in my opinion, necessarily led to more violence here in the States or more cartel activity on the streets of, say, Little Village, if that is an answer to you.
If I could comment on like a little part of your statement, which was it's about Colorado and the recent legalization in America. That has impacted cartel activity in Mexico. They've been obviously selling less, right? Because if shipping costs from Mexico to, let's say, Illinois, much higher than Colorado to Illinois or California, Illinois, or Washington, Illinois, all these places, right? So because of legalization of GCRM and medical in the United States, all these places is hurting cartels, and that's fantastic. On the downside, they've started pushing heroin, but that's a separate issue.
Well, they've been pushing heroin for a while.
Yeah, but
I mean, I don't
it's
think
a little
it's,
high.
yeah.
But it's definitely an amazing, awesome thing that we're cutting away their supplies, and that's what decrim and medical and all these other ways of having more legalized drugs. That's what happens to drug cartels.
Well, just as a follow-up, if I might, have any of you considered other options to stem paranoia in the Hispanic community here as cartel activity? I mean, the fact that you wouldn't go home or visit your relatives, your family at home, suggests to me that, you know, that we need to be thinking about some countermeasures. I guess my question is, have you thought of countermeasures?
What do you mean by countermeasures? You mean in dealing with the cartels in Mexico? Because I think they're pretty difficult.
No,
It depends on.
I didn't mean that. I meant to deal with the issues of growing fear in the Hispanic communities of the cartels beginning to get footholds in the U.S.
You know, there was a really interesting article by Jackie Serrato, who started the La Vita Facebook page and is now in the Bill. And she talked about the influence of the cartels locally, and she did a pretty good investigative report on it, and pretty much it erred on the side that they're not impacting the day-to-day quality of life of folks here in the States. So I think that's probably accurate, but I think at the end of the day, we would all probably agree on the structural policy level issues that are really reinforcing the power of cartels internationally. And I really appreciate what Roman's saying. I think if we further investigate decriminalization, further investigate our policies and make them much more progressive and makes sense, and start being smart on crime rather tough on crime, that's what's really going to disempower the cartels in very much the same way Prohibition acted here a century ago.
I just had a comment about, you said that, legalization is weakening cartels in Mexico. I think, unfortunately, that may not be happening in the long term. Because what is happening is that as soon as cartels find themselves without this business, they're going to turn into other lucrative criminal businesses. And that's happening a lot, like extortions, kidnappings, etc., etc. So I think the problem is really much more complicated. It's that we've created this situation, and I just don't think legalization is any longer the only answer to ending violence in Mexico.
Oh, without a doubt. I don't believe that if we legalize all drugs in the United States, the cartels are going to go away. They're heavily entrenched, and that's going to take a long time and probably an international effort to fix the problem. I'm sorry if I implied that.
And also,
I have to push back a little bit. Sorry, go ahead.
No, just to know also that another really big problem is that I think the current government in Mexico is starting to use the drug war as a tool for political repression. And I think that's exactly what the case of the 43 missing students is about. Because of the whole wave of drug-related violence, this enters automatically into it, so people kind of think, well, it's drug-related. It's not. It's, the government pushing groups that are under the radar with the excuse that, well, it's drug-related, and the military is already all around the country. So it's, I don't have an answer, obviously, but I think these are problems that are going to continue developing out of our drug wars.
Okay, I'm coming.
I don't know which one of you would be best equipped to answer this, but what is the Mexican legal framework for all different types of drugs, and what does their prison system look like?
I wouldn't want to go to a Mexican prison, if I was arrested there. That's as far as I know. I would guess that also they probably have gang activity in jail, as all countries do, or most. But in terms of any specifics or any really enlightening information, I've never had any. Does anybody?
No, I'm not that into Mexican policy, unfortunately.
So I think there's obvious connections between folks, particularly because of geography and the close geography between folks who are in this country and Mexico. But the fact is, my father came here when he was 7, right? And my grandmother was actually born here, raised in Mexico, came back, right? I don't have a depth of knowledge of Latin America. I'm a U.S. citizen. I root for the White Sox more than I do out there. So I couldn't answer that.
But how about the drug policies that they have written? I'm not familiar with it at all either.
What, in Mexico?
Yeah.
I can tell you about the crappy immigration policies. They're worse than the States. And the way they treat Central Americans even worse than.
In Mexico, what are the policies? Actually, there's been a recriminalization. What was deemed to be, there were a couple of news stories, I can't remember, 3-4 years ago, it was oh, Mexico decriminalizes small amounts of drugs. It had always been that way. It was a recriminalization stating the amounts tied to it, but because of the language barrier and because of the media cycle, and so it took Mexican nationals to be excuse me, no, you read this wrong. That is not correct. So, I mean, I think one of the issues that when you're looking at Mexico, and we see it here as well, just to say Ferguson, the militarization of the police force in Latin America is partly remnant of the Cold War, and then we stuck the drug war right on top of that. We just and this is in violation of many international treaties. You can't use the kind of surveillance equipment for, you know, drug war activities. But we are doing that. And so if you think about, and I mean, now I'm showing my age, when you go back to the 1980s, when you're thinking about what is happening in, you know, in Latin America, the infrastructure was there to flip it. There's always a war. We're always at war in Latin America in some way. It's either fighting communism or drugs or whatever, but it's also pumping lots of money into militarizing the police force. I mean, there wouldn't be the kind of, I don't know, it's a very complicated thing, but the policies are not liberal in Mexico.
Economically speaking, the cartels want them to stay illegal. It's very lucrative to have an illegal trade.
It is, and it's very, I mean, I think one of the issues that we run up against is for people who are trying to fight back against the cartels that they're just murdered.
I think it's...
I mean, and then they're in a gruesome way and then put on YouTube. So, I mean, that kind of stymies, you know, talking back, but...
Gentlemen.
Yeah.
Can
Here you
you
go.
tell us more about Enlace, what the agency is doing?
By the way, our financials are amazing. They really are. They always have been. Just Ron had a lot of money to paint it. He did say we're a great organization that does good work. Stephanie. First of all, I want to say I want to make a comment about Mexico because I think this. I didn't know the conversation was going to go this way, so I think it needs a little bit more context, right? And the gentleman in the back brought some stuff up that I think needs answering. Mexican society has really overgone, over the last several years, after the last decades, has really gone through major shifts. Become a much more cosmopolitan Western country. In the last several decades, birth rates have plummeted in Mexico, and urbanization has taken over in the country. Places like Monterrey, when I was there, resemble American cities more than they do your historic Mexican city, if you will. During the Great Recession here in the United States, Mexico was undergoing vast improvements in their economy. I'm sure that's arguable in a lot of senses, but generally speaking, you know, they controlled for inflation and had solid growth during the last recession that we had here. So I think that there's typically a picture painted of Mexico as a third world country that's really not becoming the case. And even then, I think when you consider the overcriminalization and the lack of progressive thinking on drug policy, I think it's really becoming a Western country in that respect, or an American country in that respect. So I'll give you that. Our organization is very much concentrated in improving the quality of life of Little Village residents, and we do that through 4 core areas of work. Violence prevention, which is the most parallel to the work going on here, what we're talking about. We do a lot of work around education and economic development. We do a lot of work around community organizing. So we've been very much on the forefront of policy change when it comes to immigration reform. We've had our undocumented youth come out of the shadows and say that they're pretty much Americans in every sense of the word, other than their documentation status. Many young people find out about their documentation status when they're applying for FAFSA and can't complete the form and ask mom and dad where their social security number is, and mom and dad say, guess what, you don't have one, right? Or the first time they try to apply for a license, right? So we've been very much on the forefront of policy change. For instance, we were able to get driver's licenses from the undocumented here in the state of Illinois. But I know it was a great win that happened some time ago.
Smart.
Uh,
last couple of years.
Smart messaging, too.
Yeah. What I think, one thing that we've worked on is criminal justice reform. And I think it's a space where really black and brown and progressive whites can come together and really form a real solid coalition on the separation of families. And it's something that we've really investigated. The fact is that largely Latino families have been losing their adults to the immigration system, to deportation. As a matter of fact, over 2 million people have been deported under our president's watch. And at the same time, largely black males have been separated from their families because of our criminal justice system. And I think it's a real topic area where we can come together and build coalitions around. And it's something that Enlace has been leading the way, or being a part of the way, in investigating, right? That potential coalition, figuring out this separation of families and how we can come together on these issues. I think that there's a long way for us to go, particularly when considering this last election here, in the mayoral election, right? The lack of ability for us to pull together the Harold Washington Coalition. There's a lot that we could potentially do moving forward, but I think when we learn from each other, learn from each other's issues, and figure out where our self-interest kind of aligns, that's what we're trying to do at Enlace, and figure out how we can move forward on.
Any comments on Puerto Rico's new drug treatment policy for heroin addicts? Like a one-way ticket? Is Chicago the only one involved in that, too? I'm just wondering.
Chicago's not the only city involved in that.
Right.
Sure. So,
I mean, you don't have the clip.
Okay.
yeah.
We could play the clip.
Okay.
It's 10 minutes.
Pretty
Do you want-
pretty straightforward story,
Do you
though.
want, well, I think the story is pretty compelling.
Yeah.
We could email that to you, or we could try to get it up here.
I think we could do a good job of summarizing.
I think we could.
I think I can't, but I think.
I think Bill Marie can.
Sure. So, yeah, it's on WBEZ, This American Life.
This American.
If you want to listen to it, read about it. But so essentially, what has been discovered is that there's a lot of homeless Puerto Ricans in Chicago, and the author of the story had sort of been talking to some of these folks and found out that they were provided free one-way plane ticket by the government of Puerto Rico, the police department, in the community to come to, in our case here, Chicago, for the most wonderful treatment for their heroin problem that you could ever imagine, that of course we know here does not exist. And so these folks have come here, been supposed to be involved in these 24-hour pseudo-AA groups that sound quite abusive in their practices. And of course, without any sort of resources, many of them without really knowing much of the language, not knowing anyone here, not knowing where the hell they are, end up on the streets, end up still using heroin, because what else do they have at that point? So yeah, so that's happening. They're also being shipped to New York and Milwaukee and other cities. It's not necessarily a unique practice. There are other places that will ship folks with severe mental illness to other cities to be treated. And yeah, so it's a really, really, really awful thing.
Can I just, I spoke to the reporter for 2 hours reporting the story and broke. And I mean, were you there, Phil, when that happened? I know Gio was here and some people were here. Anyway, I mean, it's very shocking. These facilities are unlicensed. They're overcrowded. They're run by you cannot leave for 90 days. And then once you're there for 90 days, you become one of the leaders. So basic.
It's pyramid scheme.
It's horrible. And the basic method of treatment is shame. It started in Mexico. They broke off the Puerto Rican and Mexican group because in Mexico it's been uncovered as kind of like this is not effective treatment, but for some reason it persists in Chicago. And I live in Humboldt Park, and so when the reporter called me, she said, "Do you see because what they're doing exclusively, it's not just heroin users, it's homeless injection heroin users, often with HIV. And so one-way ticket off of our island, go somewhere else. And these people have no idea. They might keep their identification if they leave, and they don't have any. I mean, it's cold in Chicago, right? Not today, that's why nobody's here, I'm assuming. But that, you know, or fewer people are here today. But you know, in the middle of winter, can you imagine you're promised social workers, nurses, detoxification, and what you get is a filthy mattress and yelled at if, yeah. So that's not treatment, it's horrifying, and it's, and if you look, it's 24 hours in Spanish, and in my neighborhood, it's just all over the place. It's hidden in plain sight, and I think that, to me, this story is sort of about the way we see drug users in general. They're hidden in plain sight because we don't want to see it. And so that reporter wanted to know, was I seeing that in Humboldt Park? And I said, well, that would explain so much of what I do see, but I don't speak Spanish, or, you know. And so she got somebody from Coit to go out, and they found 90 people in like, 2 days that had been shipped here. So this is, you know, what's the policy solution to that? What is the policy? Because, right, there's no treatment, we don't have enough treatment here.
For quality.
Right, and that's not treatment.
What's the waiting list at Ellery Call?
I mean, at Ellery Call and methadone, I mean, you know, and this is the disposability of people who inject drugs in our homes. You know, they are trash, get rid of them. And I mean, I suspect if there were a way to just flush them down the toilet, that would be. And I mean, it's, you know, so that story is pretty profound on so many levels that the government is involved, but I think it speaks so much to how we view people who use drugs, and particularly injection drugs.
I don't know the data for Puerto Rico specifically, but when we did the TEDS data for how many treatment spots there were in Illinois, over 2 years, it went from 50,000 to 34. And then before that, it was at 80,000. Those spots, that's cut in half in like 5 years. Those spots aren't coming back. There's less funding. It's a terrible situation, and shipping people in from Puerto Rico probably isn't helping it, and they should definitely have solutions there.
Does anyone have questions, follow-ups? Somebody in the back?
Hello, I'd like to direct this to Daniela. Daniela, you shared that you had personal experience, and I know that you're in journalism, and I would suspect that your personal experience really influences what you're interested in, possibly, and how you report. Do you find that there are challenges at times for you to be objective in covering things that interest you, that come from personal experience?
Absolutely. A lot of my stories have centered on drug use and drug policy. That's actually how I met Kathy. So yeah, that's a big challenge, and I think it's a challenge for any reporter, but for me especially, I think whereas some of my colleagues might have trouble being sympathetic for drug users who they've interviewed, I have the opposite problem, where maybe I'm too sympathetic and cloud my judgment a little bit. Yeah, so that's definitely a big issue for me.
And when you're reporting, do you ever share this with your, with your persons that you're interviewing or covering or anything like that?
Generally I haven't. I mean, I haven't disclosed anything like that in detail. Sometimes if I am interviewing someone to make them more comfortable, I might tell them, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I'm familiar with methadone, that sort of thing.
I had a question for the panelists. So what are the reforms that have been recently made, and which one do you think is the most important, and where do we go from there?
I can start, yeah. Well, again, going back to California just last November, the Californians voted to pass Prop 47, which would take a number of nonviolent offenses and reduce them from felonies to misdemeanors, and one of them was drug possession. And that's a huge step in the right direction, and considering the Latino population in California, that'll undoubtedly have a huge effect on them.
So we got some good news today that Chris Bernard from President Frankenfeld's office, that HB 172 looks like it's moving forward. That is essentially a bill to end automatic transfer of juveniles to the criminal court, to the adult court. Why that's important is about 54% of the young people who are automatically transferred to adult court actually end up pleading down to things that wouldn't have gotten them in the adult court and they get. There's some folks here who could talk more about the issue, more coherently about the issue than I. But I think that that's the type of effort, those are the types of coalitions, more so than one specific policy, but that type of think tank and that type of groups coming together on a specific issue that really impacts our young people. I think those are the types of policies that I'm most interested in. We were able to get a number of Latino serving institutions to support the bill, support the bill in session, sign on to support slips for the bill. And I think that that's not normally the case. I think Latino groups typically stay out of the criminal justice world. And I think we've done a good job of being able to get groups to see this as an important issue, not just for youth in general, but particularly for Latino youth as well. So I think that I'm pretty excited about, and I think this transfer reform bill, although it's not perfect, and we had to deal away from some of the things that we wanted on the bill, I think it's a good effort, and I'm looking forward to it passing pretty soon here.
Hey Mike, wait, what about the 17-year-olds not being charged as adults for misdemeanors? I'm not gonna talk that out.
That was a good one. Yeah. Well, this one was more recent, right?
I know, but that's important. I mean, that was a huge
Raise the
thing.
age?
Yes.
Yeah, raise the age was a win. Last session, two sessions ago? A couple years ago. On certain misdemeanors and certain felonies, I believe, we were able to raise juvenile court jurisdiction to the age of 17 for a number of offenses. That was a big win. Many 16-year-olds even and many 17-year-olds were being charged as adults for a number of crimes, for a number of allegations, I would say. And that was another big win. That was a collaborative effort of groups from throughout the state really coming together to support that. I think another big win, to be quite honest with you, was some defense that we've been playing as well. You know, in his infinite wisdom, our mayor, I think 2 years ago, wanted to increase mandatory minimums on gun possession.
Oh, yes.
Now, I know this is a drug policy group, but I think it's tied together. And, you know, a number of groups pushed back on that policy, and we formed a working group to push back on that. And, you know, to save face, I think he came back and asked those same groups to work with him on automatic expungement legislation. That legislation didn't go as far as we wanted it to as well, but we were able to get he was able to get the state's attorney off of opposing automatic expungement legislation. So, you know, that was directly due to our pushback on his efforts to increase automatic minimums on gun possession. So, there's been some good wins recently, and I'm excited about them moving forward.
I think as far as the things that I've been involved in with SSDP and what I've done in ICDP, some of the Good Samaritan sort of reform that we've had, that we've worked on, definitely impacts young people in Illinois. The fact that they have the ability to save a friend's life if they are at risk of overdose. That's a big one. And also on college campuses too. That's something that we're working on as well. And another sort of a little bit longer ago, but talked a little bit about it in the last panel. It used to be even worse than it is. So SSDP and other organizations worked to change, reform that a little bit so that instead of lifetime arrests, the arrest would just have to be while the person was enrolled in school. So baby steps are something that we know a lot about in drug policy work.
Yeah, just to tie that up with a bow, to make it, it used to be that if you had any drug conviction, you could not get financial aid, period, no matter when you got it. Students for Sensible Drug Policy changed that, okay? So please know you can get financial aid if you have a previous drug conviction, because people still labor under the belief that you cannot, that the retroactivity still applies. That's not true. But if you are receiving financial aid, it's still, so it's not a perfect win, but at least in terms of, you know, opening up the doors of education to people who, you know, had that history and maybe were in recovery, couldn't even access financial aid. So, I mean, and I think that was unpublicized to a certain degree. We have fact sheets on that, Mr. McGraw. Oh well, we can mail those out, email those out to anybody who wants them.
Were there any other questions from the audience?
Oh, I have a note actually. To touch on the last question, the policy in California is that that if you have a drug offense while you receive financial aid, you can't get financial aid ever again. But if you have a drug offense that took place while you weren't receiving financial aid, then you're fine to receive financial aid. So I think it's similar to Illinois, it sounds like.
This is the federal. I'm talking about federally. There was retroactivity and so then there's state grants, and that is different.
Yeah.
But I think federally, if you get a drug conviction, you can still receive financial aid.
You can, and I know that because my father, who had drug offenses, actually went back and received his college degree and was able to receive it.
While you're getting financial aid, you might have to take a year off. It depends on what the conviction is.
Yeah.
And misdemeanors don't count, just so you know. There was something that I wanted, from the earlier panel, remember Kadeen didn't make it? She was in negotiation over a 1 gram change to the penalty structure. So, hey, I'm glad she's in Springfield doing that work. And also, people should know, I mean, Danny, the panel should know that there is a bill introduced right now to sort of do exactly what California did, which is defelonize personal use amounts. So when we started the consortium, that was the first thing we wanted to do in 2005, 2006, and everybody said, you're crazy.